My guest is an enrolled member of the Klamath tribes and describes his journey into public health as a windy road that ultimately helped him articulate his passion for serving tribal communities that he had carried with him his whole life. He discusses his role in serving 43 tribes of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, and specifically his current work on developing a data sharing toolkit. You're listening to the PHEC podcast, episode 219. The field of public health is so broad, overlapping multiple industries. With epidemiology at the core of public health, there are an unlimited number of ways to target specific populations, health conditions, environmental issues, and causes that matter most to you. My name is Dr. Huntley, and I'm the host here on the Public Health Epidemiology Conversations podcast. I'm an epidemiologist, consultant, and entrepreneur with over 20 years of experience in healthcare and public health. On this podcast, my guests and I engage in conversations that demonstrate the importance of public health and epidemiology across a variety of industries, helping you think outside the box and inspire greater positive impact in communities around the world. Now, let's dive into the topic of this brand new episode. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining me on this episode. This episode is part of a special sponsored series of episodes where you'll learn about the Tribal Epidemiology Centers, often referred to as TEC, through my conversations with public health professionals working with the community at each of the centers. On this episode, you'll learn about the Northwest Tribal Epidemiology Center, which may sound familiar to some of you if you're a long-term listener of the podcast. So back in episode 154, I interviewed Tommy Gostog and Selena McCrae from the Northwest Tribal Epidemiology Center. They each share their journeys into public health, and they discuss their roles as well from that particular center. So I really encourage you to listen to that episode, and I'll be sure to provide links to it in the show notes for this episode, just for easy reference. Now, on today's episode, you'll meet Joshua Smith. He works also at the Northwest Tribal Epidemiology Center. He joins us to share about his role, as well as his perspective of public health, epidemiology, and the impact of tribal epidemiology centers on the tribal communities that he serves. Joshua is an enrolled member of the Klamath tribes and is currently a health communication and evaluation specialist with the Improving Data and Enhancing Access project, which is housed within the Northwest Tribal Epidemiology Center. Joshua has worked in tribal health for 6 years in various capacities. Currently, his focus is on how to best communicate health surveillance data in American Indians and Alaska Natives residing in the Pacific Northwest. He has always believed in empowerment through increased data access grounded in tribal data sovereignty and stewardship. Let's connect my conversation with Joshua right now. So, Joshua, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Huntley.
Oh, this is great. Why don't we start out by you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm Joshua Smith. I'm a health communication and evaluation specialist at the Northwest Tribal Epidemiology Center. I work on a project, focused on increasing access to data sharing resources. And I guess as far as the rest of my FTE, I spend a lot of time trying to communicate health data to the 43 tribes of the Pacific Northwest. That's Washington, Oregon, and Idaho.
That's a really big task. So, and I already have a lot of extra questions, but I'm going to start like I normally do. I like to hear the journey, how you got to here. So I'm going to dive in with one of my favorite questions to ask my guests, and that is really, when did you first learn about or become interested in public health?
I think more broadly, having experience growing up on the reservation, you see a lot of the impacts of substance use on Native communities, and being very close to those people and their families, I think you kind of understand the human side of health issues in a way that maybe in a larger metropolitan area you don't have to always experience. I think sometimes in a city it might be easy to dismiss an individual, but growing up in a very small community, it's hard to really escape the fact that people are people, and sometimes these larger systems negatively impact them, but they are who they are. More broadly, I think I've always really had a desire to try to figure out how to help the various tribal communities that I've come in contact with. I think part of what's always been missing is that idea of how do you do it? And I think over the years and just in my experiences with academia, it's been really trying to figure out how to refine that.
Yeah, I can understand what you're saying. So you grew up on a reservation, and was it large, small? What was that like?
It's actually very, very small. I think in the whole of the reservation, there's probably approximately 3,000 individuals, or at least tribal members.
That seems large.
Well, part of it too is the amount of space that Warm Springs occupies. It's probably one of the larger reservations as far as square footage or just the space that it occupies within Oregon.
So then you went to undergrad. Did you plan to go into public health at that point? Like, had you planned on that as a career? You laugh. I'm waiting for this story. This is going to be good.
So it's really kind of a long and windy road to a certain extent. I am a first generation student, and I think that part of the trouble with that is you may have a gap in knowledge, but I think sometimes it's hard to know what questions to ask. So I kind of felt like I was, sort of building the road in front of me as I was trying to get to my destination. And originally I started off in sociology. I think particularly because given my experiences with society, I think oftentimes individual approaches kind of miss the larger context in which we exist. At a certain point, I realized that it may be hard to work more directly with my communities in a field that can be kind of abstract and theory-based. So I moved into psychology because I thought that there could be space to maybe meld those two. After graduating, I was aware of the Northwest Area Indian Health Board, but I don't think I really knew how to operationalize what they did or the degree that you would need in order to work with them. I knew that they did research and worked with tribal communities, but I didn't really know how to fit myself within their context. So working forward in the best way that I could, I began to get really interested in clinical psychology. So I ended up getting into a clinical psychology PhD program and had a research interest in addictions and addiction statistical modeling. Ultimately, I made it through my coursework and everything, but I kind of think maybe I don't really have the patience and mindset for client documentation. And ultimately, I didn't make it through that program. I don't think I really had the supports that I needed. And also, I think maybe my writing wasn't at the level that they wanted there. So my partner, around that same time, was finishing up her bachelor's degree and had gotten into a master's of social work program at the University of Washington. So I found myself in Seattle. For those of you who don't know, it's a very expensive city with, I guess, what could be considered very niche skill set in statistics, research, that sort of thing, but without the formal degree that a lot of, I guess, employment opportunities were requiring. I ended up looking for months and months and months, and I ultimately found myself at the Urban Indian Health Institute. I think up until that time, I hadn't really figured out how to articulate what tribal public health was. But after, really kind of sitting myself down and getting my hands dirty a little bit, I just realized how in love I was with the field as a whole.
I really love that story because, well, for a lot of reasons. I think it's interesting when I when I speak with my guests on the podcast and we talk about the journey and we get into this question and this part of the discussion, I'm always fascinated to hear how people sort of arrive at public health. And it's funny, not funny, haha, funny, but just interesting that we almost have this calling in a sense in our earlier years, and we just don't really have the words, like you say, to articulate what was there all along. And I also find it interesting too that sociology, psychology, that connection, it does sort of bridge a lot of different areas together. So I can definitely relate to your progression there and following in that pattern. So I think that's interesting. I know that for me, I didn't even know what public health was until I was at the point of grad school. But once I really got in, I realized, oh wow, this is what. And I started out in the med school route, which a lot of people take that track going in. But it was really public health that was what was on my heart all those years. Just didn't know what to call it.
Yeah, I think it kind of, to me, feels like you're trying to find something in the fog. And you're sort of stumbling around and you're trying to make your best efforts to make it there. And you don't really know you're there until you're there. And then it all makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to put it. Trying to find something in the fog. I like that. I'm writing that down. I always take a lot of notes while interviewing, so I like that one. Okay, so this is a great pivot into, I'd love to know more about the work that you are currently doing. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so over the last, 9 months or so, I've been spending most of my time working on a data sharing toolkit. It's a kind of compilation of resources that is really geared at kind of pronged goals. On the one side, it's kind of geared towards helping tribal organizations and urban Indian health programs figure out how to navigate a very technical process. Data sharing has a lot of very specific documents and processes that are really geared towards protecting people's data and information, and that's important. But also it can be a difficult subject to approach if you don't have that technical knowledge. On the other side, as a lot of county, state, and federal partners are starting to engage tribes in new data adventures, I think sometimes there can be that gap of knowledge as far as some of the unique considerations of tribes, tribal organizations, and urban Indian health programs. I think sometimes they might go into those conversations without really knowing all of the legal background of these kind of designations.
Yes, that was actually what we got into a really deep conversation about this with my guest, Dr. Megan O'Connell, sorry. We started about this, and I may have to connect that episode because we talked a very deep dive on data acquisition challenges, especially for tribal data, the legal aspect of that. Just so I didn't realize that there was so many different challenges as it relates to data in the tribes.
Which I think is partially the reason why we wanted to make the toolkit itself, because oftentimes you don't really know about the depth of tribal considerations until you need to know it. And I guess also on the tribal side, going back to like my story and what we were talking about, I think in tribal health, a lot of people have this desire to like want to help tribes and tribal people. So they find themselves in positions without maybe those very, very specific skills that you might get with people who occupy similar positions at the county, state, or federal level. I think a lot of times people in tribal public health have to sort of wear a lot of hats, whereas in larger or more developed public health systems, you're able to rely on people who have that very specific knowledge base.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Can you describe more about your tech and more about the population, maybe some of the public health problems or conditions that you focus on there?
Yeah. So the Northwest Tribal Epidemiology Center is housed within our larger organization, the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board. And that board serves the 43 tribes of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Across the board, we focus on a lot of different types of projects and advocacy, from maybe more strictly policy and legislative issues to teen health. A lot of what I work on is data focused. So outside of data sharing, we have a lot of efforts geared towards identifying misidentified American Indian and Alaska Natives in public health surveillance systems. So that includes mortality, hospitalizations, cancer registries, those sorts of things. We have other projects geared more towards the tribe or clinic level interventions. We have a lot of efforts kind of geared towards increasing cancer screenings, those sorts of things.
Big undertaking there. How do you go about identifying misidentified?
So that's actually, a somewhat technical process. I guess for those of you who aren't aware, Indian Health Service is a entity set up to provide medical services to American Indians and Alaska Natives. They provide us with a registry, we call it the Northwest Tribal Registry, that has information on people who come in contact with IHS in the Pacific Northwest. So we use the Northwest Tribal Registry to link individuals who might be misidentified in state surveillance systems for many reasons. Say in hospitalization, correctly identifying somebody's race may be a low priority as far as data collection. What we can do on the back end is find somebody who may be misidentified and correctly attach an American Indian or Alaska Native tag so that we're able to provide our member tribes maybe information and statistics that are more accurate for their situation.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah. Very much the kind of work that is for the detail oriented, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, very important though. I definitely get it. I was just wondering, like, how do you even go about, go through that process? But yeah, very technical, but very much worth the effort for those times in those cases where you're able to make those corrections. Let me ask you, kind of moving into our next question. I love these conversations because it just, I'm right there on every word because there's so much to learn, I think, which is one of the reasons why I love these tech episodes. So, in your own words, how would you describe the importance of epidemiology in the work that you do in the community? Nothing tricky, just kind of curious in how you connect that.
Yeah, I think it really provides a lot of context to people's experiences and what they do. So for me, and the way that I view it, is it's a way to really kind of move past the individual and figure out how we're able to kind of make changes at more of a systems level. Oftentimes we can kind of, place a lot of blame like on individuals, but really being able to kind of understand how these larger, maybe more structural machinations kind of impact individuals, I think for me is the real expression of what epidemiology looks like in more of these practical situations.
Yeah, that makes sense. How, now this is just an extra question because I'm curious, but knowing after spending the last bit talking with you and getting to know you and your journey into public health and then more about the work that you're doing, how does it feel to be able to serve the community that you grew up in and care so much about on this really high level in this way? How does that feel to you?
It feels really good. I don't know if I could really keep myself motivated to working if I didn't really feel connected to the, communities that I serve. It's nice to be able to kind of see the face and know that even if to some extent people at my tribe may not see the direct benefits of what I'm doing right now, it's kind of, I guess, moving that needle forward or kind of pushing the ball up the hill to a certain extent. And I may not see the apex of the hill, but, at some point we might potentially get there. I think it's also humbling to a certain extent being somebody who connects both the tribe to this tribal serving entity, because also I get to sort of hear people's frustrations as far as what isn't happening, how things are going on, and, essentially what they need.
I really like that too. I often, when I coach entrepreneurs who are trying to build their consulting businesses in public health. And I often spend a good amount of time helping them to kind of rethink, their motivation for getting involved, identifying their passion. And that's either in the communities, the the population that they're targeting, that they're trying to help and serve, or the issue or problem. And sometimes then combining those together. And sometimes my clients are a little frustrated when we spend so much time there, but I keep saying the same thing that you just said. Like, you have to have that connection to what you do to drive you, because just showing up to get paid, yes, we all need to get a paycheck and pay the bills, but there has to be so much more involved in this type of work to keep you really showing up and serving on the level that it takes to make a difference in public health. So you really, what you just explained was such a perfect example of what I talk about all the time.
Well, especially, I mean, if you're, not that people can't make money, but I'm also pretty sure there are far better areas to make money. So I think if you don't really have that internal drive to figure out, like how to connect yourself with your work, it can get difficult to kind of just be able to continue this, because it does take a lot of effort and energy, especially when we're dealing with more of these larger issues that may not see immediate change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now that takes us perfectly into the last question that I wanted to ask you. We have a lot of listeners from all walks of public health, from students, graduates, career professionals, entrepreneurs. But, I really like, whenever possible, to provide them with some tips. So do you have any advice or tips for, let's say, anyone who is maybe just interested in career in public health?
So I think the main thing that I've really learned, and I think what I find most rewarding in my job, is, I guess, just the need to be flexible. So I'm a health communication and evaluation specialist. And both of those things are areas that I didn't have any experience with prior to entering into public health. I enjoy the challenge of being able to pick up new things, and while I might have mastered none of them, I continually just, learn and adapt to the situations that are presented. I learned how to make reports because we needed to create community health profiles and nobody knew how to work in Adobe. I know how to do evaluation because I have a research background, and the tech that I worked at needed somebody to help evaluate and kind of create evaluation plans. So I think the first one would just be, being flexible and willing to adapt. The other one would be, just the importance of relationships, and how I think being creative about how you meet people and really kind of fostering those relationships is important. If we kind of take something like data, you may have all of the legal precedents in the world to acquire data, but if somebody won't respond to your emails, you're just in this difficult place of not being able to get what you need. And I think the third piece of advice I would give is, I guess, just to have a sense of humor. Sometimes it's easy to feel really defeatist in public health because we're dealing with these large, oftentimes systemic issues that may not have a practical resolution within even our lifetimes. And because of that, I think we can kind of feel this ambient weight, especially, say, during a pandemic when all of us are also worked quite hard. So I just really try to take time to, I guess, kind of laugh and, find humor in what I do when it's possible.
I think that's important. It absolutely is. I like all of your tips. I think those are just really good across the board for anyone listening. I think that there's some good stuff there. I remember I interviewed Tommy and Selena from back in episode 154. So you work with both of them, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. And Tommy had quite a sense of humor from what I remember.
Yeah, he's somebody that I wish I came across as well as he does. He's a very funny individual.
I think it's good to have people like that around you in the working environment. This has been really, really good. I appreciate the conversation, you taking time to meet with me and to talk about your work and, really show your heart for what you do. I really appreciated the time and attention and you just opening up. There's just so much I took notes on tell Tommy and Selena that I said hello and continue to do this amazing work. It really matters. And I know the people who are part of your community that can appreciate it right now really do. And then there'll be those in the future that will benefit from the work that you're doing right now. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, and thank you for having me.
I'd like to thank Joshua for coming on the podcast, sharing his work with the Northwest Tribal Epidemiology Center. And as always, I took a lot of notes during our conversation, and I'd like to share just a few of my favorite takeaways with you. As Joshua talked about his journey from growing up on the reservation to his study of sociology and psychology and into working in public health, he said that discovering public health was like trying to find something in a fog. That so resonated with me personally, and I know a lot of you probably felt the same way. Public health is truly a multidisciplinary field, and it often feels like it takes a while for us to find our way or the words to articulate what has drawn us to this field. I also appreciate the way that he described the rewarding feeling of serving the community that he feels such a strong connection to. It is so important to be passionate about the work that you do and that you're doing, and to find your connection if you don't feel that spring in your little pep in your step. For those of you who have worked with me, or if you're currently working with me at any of my coaching programs, this is a perfect example of what I'm often teaching and talking about. We need to be connected with more than just showing up to get paid, but really there needs to be a deep connection to the work that we're doing, whether it's through our businesses or the place that we show up to work every day. There needs to be that real passion for what we do. And I thought Joshua did a great job of just describing that throughout the whole conversation as he talked about his journey. If you would like to learn more about the Tribal Epidemiology Centers, then I really encourage you to visit the show notes page for this episode, which is episode 219. You can go to PHECpodcast.com, and from there, just navigate to episode 219. I'll also have the links to that earlier episode 154 with Tommy Ghostdog and Selena McCrae. I think that these two episodes together will give you a really good, well-rounded view of the Northwest Tribal Epidemiology Center and the work that they're doing. Let me see. Okay, remember to subscribe to the podcast. If you are on our website, you'll see the opt there to subscribe to the podcast, which means that you'll receive our newsletter and regular communication from us as soon as new episodes are released. Or you can just follow the podcast if you're using one of the podcast apps. That way you'll be among the first to hear the latest episodes as soon as they are released. As always, remember that by working together, we are advancing the mission to improve health. All right, everyone. Until next time, have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you for listening to the Public Health Epidemiology Conversations podcast. Visit phecpodcast.com to find the show notes for each episode and to learn how to work with me.